October morning. I'd volunteered to fix the water damage in the chapel basement mainly because my daughter Haley sang in their youth choir every Sunday. And honestly, I needed something to fill my weekends while she stayed with her mother. Old churches always have their quirks: rotting joists, stone foundations that shift with the desert heat. But Grace Fellowship had bones from 1952, solid construction that just needed some love. I remember joking with Pastor Daniels about how the original builders over-engineered everything, using twice the lumber any modern code would require. I'd been down in that basement maybe 6 times over the years, usually quick repairs, a burst pipe here, some electrical work there. But this was my first real project since Pastor Whitmore passed away 5 months earlier from that sudden heart attack. Strange how the whole town seemed to age overnight after losing him. The man had baptized half of Glendale's population, including Haley just 2 years prior, his gentle voice and warm smile making even the teenagers feel welcomed at service. My crowbar hit something odd behind what I thought was solid foundation wall, a hollow thunk that shouldn't exist in poured concrete, and when I pulled away the rotting drywall someone had installed to hide it, I found a door painted the exact gray of the surrounding stone, its edges sealed with enough caulk to survive a flood, with a padlock that must have cost more than my first truck. Now I should have called Pastor Daniels right then, the new minister who'd taken over after Whitmore's death, but curiosity got me the same way it did when I was 12 and found my dad's hidden Playboy collection in the garage rafters. The padlock was a Medico military grade, the kind you'd see on government buildings, not church basements, and whoever installed it had welded a steel plate around the hasp to prevent anyone from prying it off. I spent 20 minutes with my bolt cutters, the metal groaning and fighting me every inch until it finally snapped with a sound like breaking bone. And when I pulled that door open, the smell hit me first. Not decay exactly, but something stale and chemical, like a hospital room that hadn't seen fresh air since the Carter administration. The room stretched back maybe 15 feet, narrow enough that I could touch both walls with my arms spread, and every inch of wall space held makeshift shelves built from 2x4s and plywood, the kind of rushed construction that screamed temporary but had obviously been there for years. Each shelf held boxes, plastic bins, grocery bags, all labeled with masking tape and neat handwriting I recognized immediately as Pastor Whitmore's. Those same careful letters I'd seen on countless church bulletins and birthday cards. But these labels made my chest tighten in a way Sunday service never did. Catherine Moss, 2008, red one. And inside I could see a purse, car keys, a pair of glasses folded neatly on top of what looked like a wallet. And I remembered Catherine, the dental hygienist who'd cleaned my teeth for 3 years before she supposedly ran off with some man she met online, leaving behind a husband and 2 boys who still attended service every week. My legs felt like water as I reached for another box, Jason Hendricks, 2010. And there sat his high school class ring from Desert Vista, the one his mom had saved 3 months of overtime to buy, still attached to a keychain with a miniature basketball that matched his jersey number, 17. Everyone said Jason got mixed up with dealers from Phoenix, that he'd probably ended up in some desert grave when a deal went bad, but his basketball shoes were right there in that box, the orange Nikes he'd worn to every practice, still caked with gym floor dust. Next to Jason's box sat another smaller one marked Angela Vance, 2009, and I actually had to sit down on the concrete floor when I saw her insulin kit, the purple one with the butterfly stickers her daughter had decorated, because Angela was supposed to have killed herself after her divorce, jumped off some bridge in California, according to the note they found. I counted 23 boxes total, each one a person who'd left Glendale under different circumstances: suicide, affairs, drug problems, family disputes, all the reasonable explanations small towns create when people vanish, and every single one of them had been active in Grace Fellowship before they disappeared. The earliest date I found was 2007, written on a shoebox containing a man's wedding ring and driver's license for Robert Dalton, who'd supposedly abandoned his family after gambling away their savings, though his wife Nancy still brought casseroles to every church potluck, never remarrying, always insisting Bobby would find his way home. Behind the last row of shelves, I noticed the concrete floor had been re-poured in several sections. Amateur work with visible seams, each patch roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, and my contractor's brain immediately recognized the dimensions, even as my mind tried to reject what that meant. I must have stayed in that room for an hour, taking photos with my phone, documenting every box, every name, every date, my battery dropping from full to 30% as I captured evidence of what Pastor Whitmore, the man who'd counseled my ex-wife and me through our roughest patches, who'd visited my mother in hospice every single day during her final week, had been doing while preaching about salvation. The most recent box had me dry heaving in the corner. Melissa Conway, dated just 4 months ago, a full month after Whitmore's supposed heart attack, and Melissa had left town to care for her sick sister in Nevada, even sent postcards to her book club, though now I wondered who really wrote them. My phone buzzed with a text from Haley, asking if I'd pick her up from practice early, and the normalcy of it. The simple request from my daughter, who'd sat in Whitmore's office for confirmation classes, who'd trusted him completely, made me stumble out of that room like the building was on fire. I called 911 from the church parking lot, watched 3 patrol cars arrive within minutes, then state police within the hour, then FBI by nightfall, the quiet Sunday afternoon transforming into chaos as they evacuated the building and wrapped the entire property in yellow tape. Detective Rivera, a woman with eyes that had seen too much, took my statement 7 different times, each version revealing another horrifying detail, like how several victims had sought counseling from Whitmore for depression before vanishing, or how he'd always volunteered to handle the missing person's prayer requests, standing at that pulpit with tears in his eyes, begging God to return these lost souls to their families. They brought ground-penetrating radar that evening, and by midnight they'd found what the concrete patches were hiding, though Rivera wouldn't tell me numbers, just kept repeating that I'd done the right thing, that I'd given families closure they'd waited years to receive. Word travels fast in a town of 8,000 people, and by Monday morning, Grace Fellowship's congregation had split into 2 camps: those who refused to believe their beloved pastor could harm anyone, and those who suddenly remembered odd moments, strange comments, unexplained absences that now took on sinister meaning. I watched from my truck as Nancy Dalton collapsed outside the police station after they confirmed Robert's remains, her faith in his return finally shattered, while Catherine Moss's husband stood silent with his sons, all 3 wearing expressions of people who'd been grieving wrong for 14 years. The news vans arrived like vultures, parking outside the church, the school, the diner where Whitmore had eaten breakfast every Saturday, their reporters asking how nobody noticed, how an entire community could miss what was happening beneath their feet every Sunday while they sang hymns above. Haley wouldn't talk to me for 3 days after the story broke, just sat in her room with her youth choir photos, staring at the one where Pastor Whitmore had his hand on her shoulder during last year's Christmas concert. And I understood her confusion because I felt it too. How do you reconcile the man who'd held your hand during your mother's funeral with someone capable of keeping trophies from his victims, of standing over their graves while delivering sermons about eternal life, of comforting grieving families while knowing exactly where their loved ones lay buried? Pastor Daniels tried to hold services that next Sunday, but only 40 people showed up in a sanctuary built for 300. And halfway through his sermon about faith being tested, Old Howard Keller stood up and asked the question everyone was thinking: how many more of Whitmore's secrets were still hidden, and who else in church leadership might have known? The investigation revealed that Whitmore had been hunting within his own flock for 15 years, choosing vulnerable members who came to him for guidance, people struggling with addiction, depression, isolation, those whose disappearances could be easily explained away. He'd kept meticulous records in a safety deposit box, written accounts of each killing that the FBI wouldn't release to the public, though Detective Rivera told me privately that he'd believed he was saving them from themselves, delivering them to God before they could damn their souls further, the ultimate perversion of pastoral care. They found evidence of a partner, too, someone still alive who'd helped move bodies, forge letters, maintained the illusion that victims had simply left town, and the whole community held its breath waiting for that arrest, neighbors eyeing each other with newfound suspicion, wondering who among them had helped create this nightmare. 6 weeks after my discovery, they arrested Whitmore's church secretary, Beverly Thornton, a 70-year-old grandmother who'd worked at Grace Fellowship for 30 years, who'd baked cookies for every youth group meeting, and ran the prayer phone tree with military precision. She'd been the one writing postcards from the dead, keeping their social media active just long enough to establish they'd left voluntarily, scheduling fake sightings in other states through a network of unknowing accomplices who thought they were helping track down wayward souls. The trial dominated local news for months, revealing how she genuinely believed she was helping Whitmore conduct holy work, that these people were chosen by God to transcend their earthly suffering, and watching her testimony was like staring into an abyss where faith and madness became indistinguishable. Grace Fellowship closed permanently after that, the building sold to developers who tore it down to the foundation, though they had to dig down 12 feet to remove all the contaminated soil, and even now, 3 years later, that lot remains empty because nobody wants to build where 23 people lay buried, while their families prayed for their return just 1 floor above. I still do contractor work around Glendale, though I turn down any job involving churches, and sometimes clients recognize my name from the news coverage and ask about that day, but I just change the subject and focus on their kitchen remodel or bathroom tile. Haley switched to a school choir in Phoenix after everything happened, drives the extra 40 minutes rather than sing anywhere that reminds her of Grace Fellowship, and we never talk about the 2 years she spent in Whitmore's youth group, though I notice she keeps her bedroom door locked now, something she never did before. Most of the congregation scattered to different churches across the valley, trying to find faith again in new sanctuaries, but you can spot them sometimes at the grocery store or gas station. That particular hollow look of people who discovered their shepherd was actually the wolf, who learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and sulfur, but sometimes wears a collar and knows all the right words to make you trust completely. I drive past that empty lot every day on my way to work, and while the city planted grass and everyone pretends it's just another piece of vacant land waiting for development, I know what was beneath that foundation, and I know that some holes in a community never really fill, just get covered over with fresh dirt and new grass, waiting for someone else to dig too deep and discover what small towns try so hard to bury. "11 years of appraising foreclosed properties teaches you to read a house before you even step inside, and that farmhouse outside Snowflake was screaming at me from the moment I pulled up the dirt road leading to it. My supervisor at Wells Fargo had flagged this one as a priority inspection, something about the previous owners vanishing mid-renovation and leaving 18 months of mortgage payments unpaid, which wasn't unusual, except for how insistent he was that I get out there before the end of the week. The GPS kept recalculating as I drove deeper into the high desert, past the last cell tower that would give me any signal, until finally I saw the property marker the bank had described, a rusted mailbox with no name or number, just scratches in the metal that might have been letters once. Coffee cold in my cup holder, paperwork sliding around the passenger seat every time I hit a pothole. I kept thinking about how these remote properties always had stories nobody wanted to tell. Property inspection sounds boring until you realize you're usually the first person to enter these abandoned places in months, sometimes years, walking through someone else's failed dreams with a clipboard and a camera. The farmhouse looked too clean for a repo, solar panels still gleaming on the roof, generator humming softly behind the main structure, and fresh tire tracks in the dirt that definitely weren't mine. I grabbed my gear from the truck, noting how the 12 acres of scrubland had been partially cleared in strange patterns, almost like someone had been digging irrigation channels but gave up halfway through, leaving these long trenches that ran from the house toward the hills. Inside, the smell hit me first, not decay or mold like most repos, but something chemical and sharp, like a hospital mixed with fresh concrete, and every room had been modified with new electrical outlets, reinforced floors judging by the sound of my footsteps, and those Ethernet cables snaking along the ceiling that seemed to disappear into the floor at regular intervals. My inspection routine usually took 2 hours max, but I found myself moving slower through this place, taking more photos than necessary because something about the modifications didn't add up to any normal renovation plan. The kitchen had been gutted and rebuilt with commercial-grade ventilation, the kind you'd see in a restaurant, but the dining room had been converted into what looked like a server room, racks of battery backups still blinking green even though the power should have been cut months ago. I followed one of the Ethernet cables through a hole drilled in the floor, which led me to the basement door. Except this house shouldn't have had a basement according to the original blueprints I'd pulled from county records. The door was steel, industrial grade with a magnetic lock that had somehow stayed engaged, despite the supposed power outage, and when I pushed against it, I heard the soft click of it releasing, like it had been waiting for someone to try. The basement wasn't on any of the plans, which meant it was built without permits, probably why the bank wanted this inspection done quickly before county inspectors started sniffing around. I descended concrete stairs that were too new to be original, my phone's flashlight catching fresh tool marks on the walls where someone had carved this space out of solid desert hardpan. Had to have taken months of work with serious equipment. At the bottom, a hallway stretched in both directions, lined with more steel doors, each one marked with a date written in pencil on the frame, going back 3 years, and the chemical smell was stronger here, mixed with something else, like old clothes and perfume and fear all rolled into one. The first door I tried opened into a room about 10 by 10 feet, concrete walls, concrete floor, a single LED panel in the ceiling still running on what must have been battery power, and in the corner, stacked neat as you please, were suitcases, purses, wallets, car keys, and cell phones, dozens of them. All different brands and styles, arranged like someone was cataloging them. I picked up one of the wallets, hands steady even though my mind was racing, and found a driver's license for a woman named Bethany Cromwell from Phoenix, reported missing 14 months ago according to a news article I'd seen while scrolling through my phone during lunch breaks. Another wallet belonged to James Park from Flagstaff, disappeared 2 years back on a camping trip, and suddenly I was looking at maybe 40 or 50 people's belongings, all organized by type, all documented with little tags showing dates and locations. My camera was still hanging around my neck, but taking photos seemed wrong somehow, like I'd be complicit in whatever had happened here. Yet I forced myself to document everything because this was evidence now, not just some repo inspection. And somewhere above me that generator kept humming, keeping power flowing to something down here that needed to stay running. The second room was worse because it had surveillance equipment, monitors stacked on metal shelving, all dark except for 3 that showed grainy green night vision footage of different parts of the property, including my truck parked outside. The cameras were still active, recording to a bank of hard drives that clicked and whirred in the silence, and I could see timestamp overlays showing the current date and time, which meant someone had been maintaining this system recently, probably within the last few days judging by the dust patterns on the desk. One monitor showed a view I didn't recognize at first, then realized it was looking up from underground, through some kind of periscope or hidden camera, watching the road I'd driven in on, and another showed what looked like the inside of one of those trenches I'd seen outside. Except from this angle I could see there were actually grates at the bottom, drainage grates that led somewhere, probably right back to this basement. I should have left right then, called the sheriff's department from the road, let them handle whatever this was. But I kept moving down the hallway, checking each room like completing the inspection would somehow make this normal. The third room had clothing, all cleaned and folded, arranged by size and gender, and the fourth had boxes of medications, prescription bottles with the labels torn off but the pills still inside, hundreds of bottles sorted into clear plastic bins. Room 5 stopped me cold because it wasn't empty like I expected. There was a mattress on the floor, chains bolted to the wall, scratches in the concrete like someone had tried to claw their way out, and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. The smell was different here too, human and recent, maybe a week old at most. And on the mattress was a journal, leather-bound and filled with entries in different handwriting, like multiple people had written in it over time. The last entry was dated 5 days ago. Just a single line that read, "They said someone would come for the house soon," written in shaky blue pen. And underneath that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Make sure the cameras see everything." I was photographing the journal pages when I heard it, the magnetic lock on the basement door clicking shut with that same soft sound it had made when it opened. Except this time I was on the wrong side of it. The monitors in the surveillance room would show me standing there, clutching that journal, finally understanding that this inspection wasn't random, that my supervisor sending me here alone wasn't about the bank needing a quick turnaround, and that those fresh tire tracks I'd seen weren't from someone leaving but from someone arriving, someone who knew exactly when I would be here. Panic doesn't describe what I felt, more like a cold calculation of exactly how screwed I was. No cell signal, nobody expecting me back for hours, and whoever built this place had thought through every detail. I ran back to the basement door, pushing against it, pulling on the handle. But magnetic locks don't work that way. They need power to release, and someone upstairs controlled that power. The ventilation system kicked on with a low hum, and I noticed vents in every room, wondering if that chemical smell was about to get stronger, if this was how it worked. But then I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, walking from room to room like they were doing their own inspection. The journal was still in my hand, and I flipped through more pages, finding maps of the property with tunnel systems marked in red ink, notes about delivery schedules, and lists of names with check marks next to some and question marks next to others. My supervisor's name was on there with a star beside it. I went back to the surveillance room, thinking maybe I could use the equipment to call for help, but the computers were locked, password protected, and the monitors just kept showing their feeds, including a new angle I hadn't noticed before, the basement hallway where I was standing right now, watching myself watch myself on screen. Then I saw movement on one of the exterior cameras, a van pulling up beside my truck, no license plates, and 2 people getting out wearing medical scrubs and surgical masks, carrying what looked like equipment cases, moving with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. They weren't hurrying, weren't worried about being seen, just methodically unloading their van like this was any other job. And one of them looked directly at the camera and gave a small wave, like they knew I was watching, like they wanted me to see what was coming next. The drainage grates, that's when it clicked. Those trenches weren't failed irrigation, they were escape routes or maybe disposal routes. And the journal mentioned something about the runners who tried to use them but never made it past the sensors. I grabbed a metal shelf bracket from the surveillance room and went to work on one of the grates in the hallway floor, prying at the edges until my fingers bled, because staying here meant ending up in one of those rooms or worse, and at least the tunnels gave me a chance. The grate came loose just as I heard the basement door's magnetic lock disengage with that soft click, and I didn't wait to see who was coming down, just dropped into the tunnel, landing hard on wet concrete about 8 feet down, my ankle twisting but not breaking, and started crawling through absolute darkness toward what I hoped was away from the house. Behind me, I could hear voices echoing down the tunnel, calm and professional, discussing dosages and prep times like they were planning a medical procedure, and one of them mentioned that the cameras in the tunnels had night vision so they could track my progress, guide me where they wanted me to go. I kept crawling anyway, using my phone's dying flashlight to navigate through the narrow concrete tube, trying not to think about what might be on the walls I was touching or what had happened to the others who'd tried this route. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, I hit a junction where 3 tunnels met, and I could hear water flowing somewhere below. An underground stream, maybe. Something not on their plans. I chose the tunnel that sloped downward, following the sound of water, and eventually broke through a rusted grate into a natural cave system, part of the limestone formations common in that part of Arizona. And for the first time since that door locked, I had hope. The cave led to an old mine shaft, abandoned probably since the 1940s based on the equipment I passed, and from there to a desert wash about 2 miles from the farmhouse, where I emerged covered in mud and blood, my ankle swollen to twice its size, but alive and free with my camera's memory card still in my pocket, containing every photo I'd taken. A rancher found me stumbling along Highway 77 about an hour later, half delirious from dehydration and pain, and drove me straight to the emergency room in Show Low, where I told the cops everything while a nurse cleaned gravel out of my palms. The FBI took over within hours, but when they got to the farmhouse the next morning, the basement was filled with concrete, fresh poured and still warm, all the evidence buried under tons of industrial-grade quick-set cement that would take weeks to excavate. My photos became the only proof of what I'd found. Grainy and dark, but clear enough to match belongings to missing persons cases across 3 states. Clear enough that families finally had answers, even if they'd never have closure. The bank fired my supervisor 2 days later, claimed they had no knowledge of any connection to the property, and their lawyers made sure I understood that discussing any theories about their involvement would result in lawsuits I couldn't afford to fight. I quit doing property inspections after that, moved to New Mexico, and got a job appraising commercial real estate. Nice clean office buildings with security cameras that actually keep people safe instead of documenting their disappearance. The FBI says they're still investigating, that the property's been seized as a crime scene, but I check the news every few months and nothing ever changes. No arrests, no updates. Just that farmhouse sitting empty in the desert while somewhere those people in medical scrubs are probably setting up another basement, another system, another trap for someone who thinks they're just doing their job. Sometimes at night I dream about those tunnels, about crawling through darkness while voices echo behind me, discussing medical procedures, and I wake up checking my apartment door to make sure it still opens from the inside, that the lock isn't magnetic, that I can leave whenever I want, because that's something you never stop checking once you've been on the wrong side of a door that won't open. Estate auctions always drew the same crowd around Holbrook, mostly dealers hunting for antiques and locals hoping to score cheap furniture. That Saturday morning in early June, I pulled into the old Garrison Ranch with my pickup truck and a thermos of coffee, ready to bid on some farming equipment for my own small operation just outside town. My dad had worked cattle ranches his whole life before passing 5 years back, and seeing all those weathered barns and dusty corrals brought back memories of helping him during brandings when I was barely tall enough to reach the gate latches. I recognized most faces in the crowd, folks I'd gone to school with or bought feed from over the years, everyone chatting about how the bank finally foreclosed after old man Garrison died without any heirs to claim the place. What struck me first was the sheer volume of personal belongings scattered across the auction tables, way more than you'd expect from one elderly rancher living alone. There were work boots in at least 15 different sizes, dozens of worn leather belts, stacks of faded denim jackets with different builds and wear patterns, like they'd belonged to men of various heights and body types. The auctioneer's assistant, a kid named Bradley who went to school with my nephew, kept pulling out boxes filled with wallets, pocket knives, wristwatches, even sets of false teeth in small plastic cases. Each item had a lot number taped to it, and Bradley's mother was cataloging everything on her laptop, occasionally pausing to wipe dust from her glasses and squint at some detail that didn't quite add up in their inventory sheets. I wandered over to a folding table near the barn, where they'd arranged dozens of framed photographs, most showing groups of ranch hands posing with horses or standing around branding fires. The photos spanned what looked like 40 years, judging by the changes in truck models visible in the backgrounds and the evolution from black and white to faded color prints. In every single photo, Garrison stood in the center, his distinctive curved spine and drooping left eye making him easy to spot, but the workers around him never repeated from one picture to the next. Not one familiar face carried over between seasons, which seemed impossible given how ranch work usually went, where good hands stayed on for years and built relationships with the livestock and the land. A woman named Dolores, who ran the local historical society and collected old photographs of the area, picked up one of the larger frames and studied it with a magnifying glass she pulled from her purse. She pointed out something to her husband, Frank, and they both leaned in close, whispering about recognizing someone in the photo who they thought had moved to Colorado back in the 80s. But then Dolores found another photo from 1992 with what looked like the same man's baseball cap and distinctive turquoise belt buckle laid out on a bunkhouse cot, like someone had arranged his belongings for a picture after he'd gone. The more photos we examined, the more we found these strange still life shots of personal items, always taken in the same bunkhouse room with the same iron bed frame, each one labeled on the back with just a year and a single initial. Bradley's mother suddenly stood up from her laptop, her face pale as she called the auctioneer over to look at something on her screen. She'd been cross-referencing the wallet contents with her database, finding driver's licenses and ID cards stuffed behind old receipts and worn dollar bills. The names meant nothing to most of us, but she recognized one from a missing person report her sister had filed back in 1987, when her husband never came home from what he'd said was a temporary ranch job. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Gordon who'd been running estate sales in the area since before I was born, immediately stopped the bidding and pulled out his cell phone to call the sheriff's office. While we waited for the deputies to arrive, more people started examining the personal effects with a different kind of attention, no longer looking for bargains, but for answers. Frank found a high school class ring from Winslow, dated 1979, with the initials T and W etched inside the band. A rancher's wife named Carol discovered a leather wallet with a photo of 3 young kids tucked behind a cracked driver's license, the expiration date still 2 years away from today. The mood shifted from excitement about good deals to a heavy, uncomfortable silence as everyone began to realize these weren't just forgotten belongings from workers who'd moved on to other jobs. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, followed by a detective I recognized from when she'd investigated a cattle theft case at my neighbor's place last year. Detective Shirley Watts took one look at the tables full of personal items and immediately called for backup and a forensics team from Phoenix. She asked Gordon to show her any paperwork related to the estate, and he produced several boxes of documents from his van, including decades of employment records that Garrison had kept in meticulous detail. Each file contained a single sheet with a worker's name, their start date, and a handwritten note about when they'd supposedly left, always some variation of moved on or headed back home, with no forwarding address or final paycheck recorded. The detective ordered everyone to step back from the auction items while her team photographed everything, but she allowed Dolores to point out which photographs showed the still life arrangements of belongings. Dolores had counted 37 of these images, each one dated between 1976 and just 6 months ago, when neighbors had last seen Garrison alive and walking his property line with that distinctive shuffling gait of his. The forensics photographer, a young man who kept having to steady his camera because his grip was trembling, noticed that the same rusty nail on the bunkhouse wall appeared in every shot, and that the items were always arranged in the same pattern: work boots at the foot of the bed, hat on the pillow, wallet and personal effects spread across the thin mattress like someone was taking inventory. By noon, there were 8 police vehicles parked along the ranch's dirt road, and they'd strung yellow tape around the entire auction area. Detective Watts had us all write down our contact information and asked if anyone remembered specific ranch hands who'd worked for Garrison over the years. An older man named Eugene, who'd sold hay to the ranch for 3 decades, mentioned how he'd always found it strange that Garrison went through workers so fast, sometimes hiring new hands every few months, always saying the previous ones couldn't handle the isolation or had drinking problems. Eugene remembered dropping off a hay delivery in 1995 and chatting with a friendly worker named Luis, who'd promised to help him load some equipment the following week. But when Eugene returned, Garrison said Luis had hitchhiked to Phoenix in the middle of the night without even collecting his pay. Around 2 in the afternoon, they brought in cadaver dogs, and within minutes, the first dog alerted near the old well behind the main barn. The handler, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Tried to keep her expression neutral, but I saw her jaw clench when the dog sat down and refused to move, whining in that particular way that meant it had found something significant. The second dog alerted at the exact same spot, then ran in widening circles, alerting again and again at different points in what looked like a rough grid pattern extending out from the well for about 50 yards. The forensics team started marking each spot with small orange flags, and soon that patch of dusty ground looked like a miniature cemetery with flags instead of headstones, far too many to be explained by buried livestock or ranch animals. Detective Watts gathered those of us who'd been at the auction and told us we were free to leave, but asked us to remain available for follow-up questions. She mentioned that the FBI would likely get involved given the scope of what they were uncovering, and that the investigation would probably reveal victims from multiple states who'd come to Arizona looking for ranch work. As I walked back to my truck, I passed the table with all those photographs, and one caught my eye. A group shot from 1988 where a young man in the back row wore the same style of watch my father had worn, a silver Timex with an expandable band that he'd gotten for his 40th birthday. My chest tightened as I remembered Dad mentioning a cousin who'd disappeared around that time, supposedly run off to Alaska for pipeline work, though the family never heard from him again. The excavation took 3 weeks, and the final count was 41 bodies, all buried in shallow graves in that grid pattern the dogs had detected. Most were migrant workers or drifters who'd answered ads for ranch work, men without close families or anyone to report them missing. The forensics team found that Garrison had poisoned them with antifreeze mixed into coffee or food, then buried them within hours, keeping their belongings as some kind of twisted trophies. They found journals in his house where he'd written brief notes about each man, criticizing their work ethic or personality flaws, as if justifying what he'd done. The FBI traced several victims through DNA and dental records, finally giving families answers about relatives who'd simply vanished. The ranch was eventually demolished, the land sold to the state as part of a settlement with the victims' families, and now it's just empty desert with a small memorial plaque that most people driving past would never notice. "6 months into wearing the badge, and you start recognizing patterns on the desert highways. Same truckers making their weekly runs, same spots where teenagers race their pickups on Friday nights, same mile markers where coyotes dash across the asphalt chasing jackrabbits. My patrol route from Wickenburg to Salome had become as familiar as my own driveway, 87 miles of Arizona State Route 60 that I could navigate with my eyes closed. That particular night in early September, the thermometer on my cruiser still read 94 degrees at 11 p.m., and the radio had been quiet for nearly 2 hours, except for dispatch checking in every 30 minutes like clockwork. I'd just passed mile marker 43 when I spotted the lights ahead, maybe half a mile up where the highway curves slightly near Centennial Wash. Red and blue strobing against the desert darkness, multiple vehicles arranged in what looked like a checkpoint formation. Strange thing was, nobody had mentioned any DUI operations scheduled for that night, and I would have been notified since this fell directly in my patrol sector. Protocol demanded that all highway units be aware of any traffic stops or checkpoints in their assigned areas, especially on a stretch of road this isolated where backup could take 40 minutes to arrive. I eased off the accelerator and grabbed my radio, calling dispatch to confirm what I already suspected they'd say. Dispatch came back negative, no scheduled operations in my sector, no other units reporting activity near Centennial Wash. The woman on the radio, Donna, who'd been working nights longer than I'd been alive, asked if I needed backup to investigate. I told her to stand by while I approached, figuring maybe it was county sheriffs or even federal agents working something they hadn't bothered to coordinate with us. Happens more often than you'd think out here near the border, different agencies stepping on each other's toes, though usually someone gives us a courtesy heads up. As I got closer, I counted 4 vehicles total, what appeared to be 2 cruisers and 2 unmarked SUVs, all with light bars active, positioned to funnel traffic into a single lane. The first thing that struck me as wrong was the uniforms. Even from 30 yards out with my headlights illuminating the scene, I could tell these weren't standard Arizona Highway Patrol, weren't Maricopa County, weren't any department insignia I recognized. Dark blue, almost black, with reflective strips in odd places, diagonal across the chest instead of horizontal. And these guys were wearing tactical vests over their uniforms but no visible badges or nameplates. One of them stepped forward with his hand up, signaling me to stop, and he had this earpiece with a coiled wire disappearing into his vest, like Secret Service or something. I rolled down my window, and the desert heat immediately flooded the air-conditioned cabin, bringing with it the smell of creosote and dust. The man who approached my window had a face I'll never forget, not because of any particular feature, but because of how absolutely average it was, like someone had used AI to generate the most generic white male face possible. When he spoke, his accent was neutral, no regional markers, just flat American English that could have come from anywhere or nowhere. He asked for my identification, which immediately set off every alarm in my head because I'm sitting there in a marked Arizona Highway Patrol vehicle wearing my full uniform. I asked him what agency he was with, and he just repeated his request for identification, his expression never changing, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized phonetically without understanding the words. Behind him, I could see 3 other men in similar uniforms standing at various points around their vehicles. And here's where it gets genuinely bizarre. None of them were moving, not shifting their weight, not turning their heads to look at passing tumbleweeds, not even adjusting their stance against the desert wind that was picking up. They stood like mannequins, perfectly still except for their hair and clothing rippling in the breeze. One of them was holding what looked like a tablet or electronic clipboard, but the screen was facing away from me, casting this unnatural white glow on his face that made his features look washed out and skeletal. I reached for my radio again, keeping my eyes on the man at my window, and told Donna I was going to need that backup after all. Possible impersonation of law enforcement officers. The moment I said those words into the radio, the man at my window took a step back and made this hand gesture to the others, just a quick circular motion with his index finger. All 4 of them moved in perfect synchronization toward their vehicles. No rushing, no panic, just smooth, coordinated movement, like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario 100 times. I put my cruiser in park and stepped out, my hand instinctively resting on my service weapon, calling out for them to stop and identify themselves. Not one of them acknowledged me, just continued their synchronized retreat to their vehicles. That's when I noticed their cruisers had no department markings, no unit numbers, just white doors with generic star-shaped badges that could have been bought from any police supply website. What happened next still makes me question my own perception, even though I've watched the dashcam footage probably 200 times since that night. They started their vehicles simultaneously, all 4 ignitions turning over at the exact same moment. And as they pulled away in a perfect convoy formation, their emergency lights were still flashing. But here's the thing that nobody can explain. On the dashcam video, those lights just cut out mid-frame. Not like someone hit a switch, but like they simply ceased to exist between one fraction of a second and the next. One frame shows 4 vehicles with active light bars heading north on Route 60. The next frame shows the same vehicles, but the lights are gone, just gone, like they were edited out of reality. I stood there on that empty highway, watching their taillights disappear into the darkness, while Donna's voice crackled through my radio asking for my status. Backup arrived 17 minutes later, 2 units racing in from Wickenburg with their sirens wailing. By then, I'd walked the entire area where the checkpoint had been, using my flashlight to search for any evidence they'd been there. No tire marks in the soft shoulder where they'd been parked, no footprints in the desert sand despite the fact that I'd watched them walking around. Not even the usual trash you'd find at any traffic stop. No cigarette butts, no coffee cups, nothing. The only thing I found was this weird residue on the asphalt, like someone had spilled metallic paint that had already dried. these silver-gray patches arranged in an almost perfect rectangle where one of their vehicles had been positioned. I scraped some of it into an evidence bag, though the lab later said it was just standard road surface material. Nothing unusual about its composition. The investigation that followed turned into one of those cases that gets passed around the department in whispers. Investigators pulled traffic camera footage from both directions, but the cameras mysteriously showed nothing during that 20-minute window, just empty highway, even though 3 civilian vehicles had passed through and their drivers independently reported seeing the checkpoint. A trucker named Walter Gibson had even been stopped by them, said they asked him bizarre questions about his cargo manifest, specifically wanting to know if he was carrying any agricultural products or soil samples, which he wasn't. A couple in an RV, the Andersons from Michigan, said the men had waved them through after shining flashlights into their vehicle for an uncomfortably long time without saying a word. All 3 witnesses described the same thing: dark uniforms, no proper identification, and something fundamentally wrong about how these men moved and spoke. 2 weeks after the incident, things took an even stranger turn. The FBI showed up at our station, not the Phoenix field office guys we sometimes work with, but agents from somewhere back east who wouldn't specify which division. They confiscated all the evidence, including my dash cam footage, though I'd already made personal copies like any smart cop would do. They interviewed me for 6 hours straight, asking the same questions over and over, particularly about the exact wording the fake officers used, their physical descriptions, and whether I'd noticed any unusual electromagnetic interference with my equipment. They seemed especially interested in the timing, down to the second, of when those emergency lights vanished from the video. Before they left, they made it clear this was now classified as a federal matter, and any further discussion about the incident could be considered interference with an ongoing investigation. Since then, I've heard through unofficial channels about similar incidents in Nevada, Utah, and Eastern Oregon, always on isolated highways, always late at night, always with the same profile: fake law enforcement, synchronized movements, bizarre questions about agricultural products or geological samples, and evidence that just doesn't add up. The truckers have started warning each other on their CB channels, calling them the phantom checkpoints, though most people think it's just another urban legend like the black-eyed kids or the vanishing hitchhiker. But I know what I saw that night, what my camera recorded, and what those other witnesses experienced. Whoever those men were, whatever they were looking for out there in the desert, they're still operating. I've transferred to day shifts now. Told my supervisor it was about wanting a better schedule, but the truth is, I can't drive that stretch of highway at night anymore without constantly checking my mirrors, wondering if I'll see those lights again, wondering if next time they won't just let me drive away. January in Bisbee meant 2 things: tourists gone and weather that could turn mean without warning. I'd inherited my grandmother's place just outside town limits the previous spring, right after finishing my nursing degree at 31, and most folks thought I was crazy for actually moving in. A single woman living alone 40 minutes from the nearest neighbor, they said, shaking their heads at the pharmacy or the grocery store. But after 7 years of cramped apartments and roommates who never cleaned their dishes, that little adobe house nestled against the Mule Mountains felt like freedom itself. I had my books, my cat Oliver, and enough savings to take a few months off before starting at the regional hospital. What I didn't have, as I would learn that night, was any real understanding of why my grandmother had installed so many locks on her doors, or why she'd spent her last years writing those strange letters to the sheriff about lights in the hills. That particular evening started like any other winter night in southern Arizona, cold dropping fast once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, wind picking up and making the old wooden window frames rattle. I was making dinner, just some pasta and sauce from a jar, when I noticed the first snowflakes drifting past the kitchen window. Snow in Bisbee wasn't unheard of, but a real storm was rare enough to make me stop and watch. Within an hour, it was coming down heavy, coating the desert landscape in white, transforming the familiar saguaros and ocotillos into strange, hulking shapes. Oliver sat on his perch by the window, tail twitching at something outside that I couldn't see. Around 7, I tried calling my friend Claire in town to joke about the weather, but my phone had no signal. Not unusual out here when storms rolled through. I wasn't worried yet. I had firewood, plenty of food, and the generator my grandmother had installed would kick in if the power went out. I actually felt cozy, safe even, watching the snow pile up on the porch rails while I settled in with a paperback thriller, the irony of which wouldn't hit me until much later. At exactly 9:17, I know because I'd just checked my phone hoping for signal, everything went dark. Not the gradual dimming you get when a storm knocks down a power line somewhere far away, but an instant, complete blackness, like someone had thrown a switch. The heater's hum died. The refrigerator stopped its gentle rumbling, and suddenly all I could hear was wind and snow hitting the windows. I felt my way to the kitchen drawer where I kept a flashlight, knocking over my water glass in the process. The crash made Oliver yowl and bolt upstairs. As I clicked on the flashlight, I waited for the familiar rumble of the generator kicking in. My grandmother had paid good money for that thing. Always paranoid about losing power out here. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then a full minute. Nothing. The house grew colder by the second. That high desert cold that seeps through walls and finds your bones. I pulled on my jacket and headed for the back door, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, to check the generator shed. I'd made it halfway across the kitchen when I heard them. Footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, crunching their way around the side of the house toward the front porch. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or javelina. These had weight behind them, a rhythm that only comes from 2 human legs. I clicked off my flashlight immediately, muscle memory from all those true crime podcasts I'd listened to, and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps continued, unhurried, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. They stopped right at my front porch, maybe 10 feet from where I stood frozen in my dark kitchen. For a moment there was only silence and the whisper of falling snow. Then I heard something that made every nerve in my body fire at once. The distinct metallic scraping of someone trying different keys in my front door lock. Not picking it, not forcing it, but methodically trying key after key like they had a whole ring of them. My mind raced. Who would have keys? The previous owners? Someone my grandmother knew? The scraping stopped, followed by a low grunt of frustration, and then the footsteps started again, moving now toward the back of the house where I'd been heading, toward the generator shed, toward the only other door. I had maybe 30 seconds before those footsteps reached the back door. My legs finally responded, carrying me on silent, socked feet to the hallway closet where my grandmother had kept her hunting rifle. My fingers found it in the dark, dusty but solid, and I grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. I'd learned to shoot years ago, but loading in pitch blackness with trembling fingers while listening to those steady footsteps getting closer was something else entirely. I managed to get 3 shells in before I heard the back door handle rattle. Then, just like with the front door, came that horrible scraping of keys. One key, then another, then another. Whoever this was had been prepared, had planned this. The wind howled, covering the sound of my breathing as I positioned myself at the end of the hallway with a clear view of the back door. Through the small window in the door, I could make out a shape. Tall, bulky, in what looked like a heavy coat, face obscured by darkness and snow. The figure tried another key, and this time I heard the subtle click of a lock turning. My grandmother had installed a deadbolt and a chain lock in addition to the regular lock. The doorknob turned, and the door pushed inward an inch before catching on the chain. The figure didn't curse or kick the door, or do any of the things a frustrated burglar might do. Instead, they pulled something from their coat. A pair of bolt cutters, the long handles gleaming faintly in what little moonlight filtered through the storm clouds. They slipped the cutting end through the gap in the door, searching for the chain, and that's when I saw their wrist in the sliver of space, a thick leather watch band, and below it, a tattoo I recognized with a sick jolt of terror. 3 mountain peaks with a sun rising behind them. I'd seen that tattoo before, several times actually, on the arm of a man named Clayton who ran the hardware store in town. The same man who'd helped me change the locks when I first moved in. The same man who'd made copies of my keys for the spare set I'd wanted to hide outside. The same man who'd asked so many questions about me living alone, about my schedule, about whether anyone ever came to visit. The bolt cutters found the chain and began to close with a metallic grinding sound. In about 5 seconds, he'd be inside my house. I raised the rifle and pumped a round into the chamber, the sound unmistakable even through the door and the storm. The bolt cutters stopped moving instantly. For 3 heartbeats, neither of us moved. Him on one side of the door with his arm still through the gap, me on the other with the rifle aimed at chest height. Then his arm slowly withdrew, pulling the bolt cutters back through. I heard his boots shift in the snow, and when he spoke, his voice was different from the friendly hardware store owner I thought I knew. Lower, rougher, with an edge that made my skin prickle. "Now, there's no need for that," he said, almost conversationally, like we were discussing paint colors instead of him breaking into my home. "I just wanted to check on you in the storm. Power's out all over town. Got worried when I saw your place go dark." The casualness of the lie made my anger spike through the fear. "Get off my property, Clayton," I called back, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I know you cut my power line. I know you've been watching me." There was a pause, then a low chuckle that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Your grandmother said the same thing, you know. Always so paranoid. Always thinking someone was out to get her. Shame what happened to her in the end." My finger found the trigger as pieces clicked together in my mind. My grandmother's death had been ruled natural causes, heart failure in her sleep, but she'd been healthy for her age, still gardening and hiking the week before she died. She'd been writing those letters to the sheriff about someone watching her house, about lights in the hills at night, about feeling unsafe. The sheriff had dismissed it as an elderly woman's paranoia, but what if she'd been right all along? What if Clayton had been doing this for years, watching women who lived alone, waiting for the right moment? "What did you do to her?" I demanded, keeping the rifle trained on the door. He didn't answer directly, but I heard him moving, his boots crunching through snow as he walked along the back of the house. He was heading toward the cellar doors, old wooden panels that led to the crawl space under the house. I'd never gone down there. My grandmother had kept them padlocked, said it was just full of spiders and old junk. But now I remembered something else. She'd mentioned once that the previous owners had connected the cellar to the house through a trap door in the pantry, for tornado safety back in the 50s. If Clayton knew about that connection, if he had keys to the padlock too, he could get inside without going through either door. I ran to the pantry, nearly tripping over Oliver, who'd come downstairs to investigate. The cat hissed at something I couldn't see, his fur standing on end, then bolted back upstairs. My flashlight beam swept across the pantry floor until I found it, a square outline in the floorboards, painted over but visible if you knew where to look. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the shelf and placed it on top of the trap door, then added a sack of flour and everything else heavy I could find. It wouldn't stop him, but it would slow him down and make noise if he tried to come through. From somewhere beneath the house came a metallic clank, then another. He was in the cellar. I could hear him moving around down there, searching for something. The trap door under my makeshift barricade creaked slightly, testing. Then silence. Long, stretching silence that made my ears ring. I stood there in the dark pantry, rifle ready, listening to my own heartbeat and waiting for his next move. That's when I heard something that confused me at first. The generator suddenly roaring to life outside, flooding the house with light. Every bulb blazed on at once, blindingly bright after so much darkness. But that made no sense. Why would he fix the power he'd cut? Then I understood, and the realization hit me like ice water. He wanted the lights on so he could see me from outside. All those windows I'd never thought to cover with curtains because there were no neighbors to worry about. Now they were like a stage, displaying my every movement to someone standing in the darkness beyond. I was lit up like an actress in a spotlight, while he was invisible in the storm. I dropped to the floor immediately, crawling military-style toward the living room where the curtains were drawn. Behind me, I heard the cellar doors slam shut and footsteps running through the snow circling the house. He was looking for me through the windows, hunting for his perfect shot or angle of entry. I reached the living room and pressed my back against the wall between two windows, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped somewhere near the kitchen windows. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten, the distinct sound of glass cutting, that high-pitched squeak of a glass cutter scoring a window. He was going to cut a hole, reach through, and unlock a window from the inside. No keys needed, no forcing doors. Just a clean, quiet entry while I huddled here in the light he'd so thoughtfully provided. I knew I had to move fast. The glass cutter stopped, and I heard a sharp tap. He was breaking out the scored circle. I belly crawled to the breaker box in the hallway, reached up and flipped the main switch. Darkness swallowed everything again. This time, I heard him curse loudly from outside, the first real sign of frustration he'd shown. Good. Let him be the one stumbling blind in the snow. I made my way back to the kitchen by memory, avoiding the furniture I knew was there, and positioned myself where I could see both the back door and the window he'd been working on. The hole in the glass was visible as a darker circle against the dark window, about the size of a softball, right next to the window latch. Snow was already blowing through it, creating a small drift on my kitchen counter. For a moment, everything was still except for the wind. Then I saw movement at the hole, a gloved hand reaching through, feeling for the latch. I raised the rifle and fired without hesitation. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and the window exploded outward in a shower of glass. The hand vanished instantly, and I heard Clayton swearing and stumbling through the snow, moving away from the house. I'd missed him, probably intentionally. I couldn't bring myself to actually shoot someone, even him. But the message was clear. For the next hour, nothing happened. I stayed in my defensive position, rifle ready, listening. The snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, but Clayton had gone silent. Maybe I'd scared him off. Maybe he was waiting me out. My phone suddenly buzzed. One bar of signal had appeared. I quickly dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She said units were already on their way. Apparently, Clayton's wife had called 20 minutes ago when she'd discovered his workshop. She'd found what she called a disturbing collection. Hundreds of photos of my grandmother's house, detailed notes about her routines, and similar documentation about 4 other women in the county, including me. She'd also found my grandmother's missing jewelry and a key ring with copies of keys labeled with addresses. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, that officers were 5 minutes out despite the storm. As I waited, I heard sirens in the distance growing louder. Then from somewhere outside, Clayton's voice, calm again but with an edge of something like disappointment. They never would have known if you'd just been friendly, just like your grandmother, too suspicious for your own good. I didn't respond. 2 minutes later, red and blue lights filled my windows and I heard officers shouting commands. They found Clayton trying to hide in the generator shed, still holding the glass cutter and the bolt cutters, his right hand bleeding from where flying glass had caught him. The trial made headlines across Arizona. Clayton Pierce, that was his full name, had been stalking and terrorizing women in the area for over 15 years. The prosecutor presented evidence linking him to my grandmother's death. He'd been entering her home at night, using his copied keys, moving things around, creating stress that likely triggered her fatal heart attack. They found journals in his workshop dating back decades, documenting his obsession with women who lived alone, especially those he'd helped at his hardware store. 4 other women came forward during the investigation, sharing stories of strange incidents they'd dismissed as coincidence, missing items that would reappear days later, doors they swore they'd locked found open, the feeling of being watched that everyone told them was just paranoia. One woman, a retired teacher named Dorothy, broke down crying when she learned the truth. She'd moved away 3 years ago, convinced she was losing her mind when things in her house kept moving on their own. Clayton got life without parole. His wife divorced him and left town. The hardware store closed and someone from Phoenix bought the building to turn it into an antique shop. I still live in my grandmother's house. I installed security cameras, motion lights, and a better alarm system. I got bars for the basement windows and replaced all the locks again, this time doing it myself. Oliver still sits by the windows, but now he seems calmer, like whatever he was sensing before is finally gone. Sometimes, on winter nights when the wind picks up, I remember that night and check my locks twice. But I refuse to let fear drive me from the home my grandmother loved, the home she tried to protect. I know now that she wasn't paranoid. She was right. And her refusal to be driven away, even in the face of real danger, gave me the strength to stay and fight when my turn came. The sheriff's department formally apologized for dismissing her concerns, and they've implemented new protocols for handling stalking reports. I started working at the hospital last month, and I'm slowly making friends in town. People still whisper about what happened sometimes, but mostly they just nod respectfully when they see me at the store or the diner. I'm the woman who fought back, who survived, who helped expose a predator that had been hiding in plain sight for years. My grandmother would be proud. Dust devils twisted across the dead alfalfa fields like angry ghosts the morning I signed the papers at county records. My father's funeral had been 5 days earlier, August 2017, and I'd spent those days wandering the ranch house in a daze, opening drawers full of his things and closing them again without really seeing what was inside. The lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Paulson, had explained the inheritance in simple terms, but I barely heard her over the ringing in my ears that hadn't stopped since the heart attack took him. 26 years of watching Dad work himself into the ground, and now the whole dying operation was mine. The ranch sprawled across 240 acres of cracked earth in eastern Arizona, about an hour outside of Tucson, where rain was a concept people talked about the way they talked about winning the lottery. The Brennan property sat directly east of ours, separated by a fence line that had been the subject of arguments, threats, and one fistfight that had landed both our fathers in county lockup back in 1993. The dispute went back to my grandfather's time. Something about a survey error in the 1950s that put our well 6 feet onto what the Brennans claimed was their land. Dad had shown me the original survey maps 100 times, his finger stabbing at the faded lines, insisting we were in the right. But Thomas Brennan, the patriarch next door, had his own maps, his own surveyor's report from a different year, and his own absolute certainty that we'd been stealing his water for 3 generations. I'd grown up watching the 2 old men glare at each other across that fence, their hatred thick enough to taste in the dry air. When Thomas's son Kevin took over their operations after the old man's stroke, things got worse instead of better. Kevin was my age, maybe a year older, and he'd inherited his father's rage along with the land. We'd gone to the same high school, sat in the same classrooms, and never spoken a single word to each other that wasn't an insult. The whole valley knew about the Brennan-Sullivan feud, knew to stay clear when either family came to town, knew that bringing up the subject in conversation was like lighting a match near a gas leak. The well ran dry on a Wednesday morning in late August, 3 weeks after I'd buried Dad. I turned the kitchen faucet and got a coughing sputter, then nothing but air hissing through the pipes. My first thought was mechanical failure, maybe the pump finally giving up after decades of constant use. But when I walked out to check the wellhead, I found the gauge readings showed the water table had simply dropped below the pump's reach. The drought had been brutal that summer, the worst anyone could remember, with temperatures pushing 115 degrees day after day and not a cloud in the sky since April. But our well had always been deep, one of the best in the valley, fed by an aquifer that Dad swore would outlast us all. Seeing it dry felt like losing him all over again, like the land itself was dying now that he wasn't here to fight for it. I spent that entire day calling well drilling companies, getting estimates that made my stomach hurt, trying to figure out how I was going to afford to drill deeper when the ranch account was already bleeding money. The Brennan well was still running. I could see Kevin's irrigation system going full blast the next morning, water arcing across his fields in silver streams, while my crops withered in the heat. He was standing by his fence line when I drove past, arms crossed, watching me with this expression that made my jaw clench so hard my teeth hurt. We didn't wave, we didn't acknowledge each other, but I saw the satisfied look on his face, the way his mouth curved just slightly, and I understood that he was happy my well had failed. That night I couldn't sleep, lying in Dad's bed because I hadn't been able to bring myself to move into it permanently, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazy circles and thinking about that smug look on Kevin's face. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went into Dad's office, a cramped room off the kitchen that smelled like cigarette smoke and old paper. I started going through his files, looking for something, anything that might help me figure out what to do. That's when I found the notebook, shoved in the back of the bottom drawer underneath a stack of tax returns from the 80s. The notebook was small, the kind with a black cover and graph paper inside, and every page was filled with my grandfather's handwriting. I recognized it from old letters I'd seen, that cramped, angular script that slanted hard to the right. Most of it was measurements and calculations, boring stuff about water table depths and drilling costs. But about halfway through, I found an entry dated March 1959 that made me read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. My grandfather wrote that he and Thomas Brennan's father, William, had made a deal. William had a gambling problem, owed money to some dangerous people in Phoenix, and he'd come to my grandfather desperate. The deal was simple. William would claim the survey was wrong, would insist our well was on his land, would start the dispute publicly. In exchange, my grandfather would loan him $8,000, no interest, to be paid back over 10 years. The beauty of it, my grandfather wrote, was that the argument would keep property values low, keep outsiders from buying up land in the valley, keep things the way they'd always been. Both families would benefit from scaring off developers and speculators who'd been sniffing around since the war ended. But then, I turned the page and found the entries from 1961, and my hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped the notebook. William Brennan had stopped making payments after the first year. My grandfather had confronted him, and William had laughed, said the deal was off, said he'd keep up the property line dispute anyway because it gave him leverage. Then came the entry from November 1961, just 3 lines in my grandfather's handwriting. William won't listen to reason, settled it tonight. Thomas doesn't know what his father was. I sat there in that office with the notebook open in my lap, the air conditioner rattling in the window, trying to understand what I was reading. William Brennan had disappeared in November 1961. Everyone in the valley knew the story because it had been the biggest news for years. He'd supposedly left town with some woman he'd been seeing, abandoned his family, never came back. Thomas had been 17 when his father vanished, had grown up believing the man was a coward who'd run off. But my grandfather's words kept repeating in my head, settled it tonight. The implications were slamming into me one after another, and I felt sick. I spent the rest of that night reading every page of the notebook, finding more fragments that painted the full picture. My grandfather had buried William Brennan somewhere on our property, had maintained the feud with Thomas to keep him angry and distant, had passed that hatred down to my father without ever telling him the truth. The final entry, dated 1984, was written in shaky handwriting, clearly near the end of my grandfather's life. Never told Michael the real reason. Let him think it's about the survey. The boy Thomas grew into a hateful man, which makes this easier. Sometimes I wake up and think I hear William calling from the ground. Getting old makes a man remember things he'd rather forget. The well runs deep, deeper than anyone knows. I read that line about the well 5 times, feeling something cold settling in my chest. Our well, the well that had just run dry. The well that Dad had always said was the deepest in the valley, drilled by my grandfather himself in 1962, the year after William disappeared. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. I walked outside even though it was still dark, walked across the yard to the wellhead, stood there looking at the concrete pad and the pump housing while the sky started turning gray in the east. When the sun came up, I called a drilling company out of Tucson and told them I needed to drill deeper. Cost be damned. The crew showed up 2 days later, 3 guys in a truck with a rig that looked like it had been used to drill wells since the 70s. The foreman, a weathered man named Vincent with sun-damaged skin like old leather, asked me how deep I wanted to go. I told him to keep drilling until we hit water again, whatever it took. They started work that afternoon, the drill bit chewing into the earth beside the old well, the noise echoing across the valley like a scream. Kevin Brennan came to the fence line that evening, stood there watching with his arms crossed, his face hard. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the drilling noise, probably some insult about throwing good money away, but I ignored him. The crew worked for 3 days straight, drilling down through layers of rock and sand, going deeper than the original well. On the 3rd day, around 4 in the afternoon, Vincent came to the house with his hat in his hands and this expression on his face that I'll never forget. He asked me to come look at something they'd found. The drill had pulled up fabric first, rotted and stained but still recognizable as denim. Then came fragments of bone, small pieces that Vincent had laid out on a tarp like evidence at a crime scene. He didn't say anything, just pointed at them and waited for me to react. I stood there staring at what was left of William Brennan, pulled up from 60 feet below ground where my grandfather had dropped him down that newly drilled well shaft in 1962. Vincent asked if he should call the sheriff, and I told him yes, even though every instinct was screaming at me to say no, to have them bury it all again and pretend we'd never found anything. But I couldn't do that. Whatever my grandfather had done, whatever my father had unknowingly protected, it ended now. The sheriff's department showed up within an hour, and by sunset there were 4 squad cars in my driveway and a forensics team setting up lights around the drill site. Word spread through the valley faster than a brush fire. Kevin Brennan showed up at my fence line just as they were bringing up more remains, and I watched his face change as he understood what was happening. He went white, then red, then started screaming at me across the fence, accusing me of murdering his grandfather, of lying, of continuing the family tradition of destroying the Brennans. I walked over to him with the notebook in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and I held it out through the fence. He snatched it from me, started reading, and I watched his expression shift from rage to confusion to horror as he realized his grandfather hadn't abandoned the family at all. Thomas Brennan had spent 60 years hating a man he thought was a coward, had raised his son to hate my family, had died 2 years ago still believing his father had run off with some woman. Kevin read every page while the police worked behind me, and when he finished he just stood there holding the notebook, his face completely blank. He asked me why I'd drilled deeper, why I hadn't just left it alone, and I told him the truth. Because the well ran dry and I didn't know what was down there until it was too late. He laughed at that, this bitter sound that had no humor in it, and said that his father had always told him our well was cursed, that nothing good would ever come from that ground. Then he turned and walked back to his house without another word, and I didn't see him again for 3 days. The investigation took over my life for the next month. Detectives came and went, asking questions about my grandfather, about my father, about what I knew and when I knew it. They brought in anthropologists who confirmed the remains were male, approximately 40 years old at time of death, consistent with someone who'd been dead since the early 60s. Dental records eventually confirmed it was William Brennan. The district attorney spent weeks trying to figure out if there was anyone left to prosecute, but my grandfather had died in 1987, and my father had clearly never known the truth. They closed the case as a cold homicide with no living suspects, which felt like the worst possible outcome because it meant William's murder would just sit there in the files forever, solved, but not really resolved. The local newspaper ran the story, and suddenly everyone in the valley who'd grown up hearing about the Sullivan-Brennan feud understood that it had all been built on a lie and a buried body. I got calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people asking questions I couldn't answer, demanding to know if my father had really been innocent or if he'd been covering it up all along. I told them all the same thing. Dad didn't know. He died believing the fight was about water and property lines, just like Thomas Brennan had. Kevin came to my door on a Friday evening in late November, after the news crews had finally stopped showing up and the valley had started to move on to other gossip. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, and he asked if we could talk. We sat on my porch drinking beer while the sun went down, not saying much at first, just existing in the same space without the weight of inherited hatred between us. He told me his mother had taken the news hard, that she'd spent 60 years married to Thomas, believing her father-in-law was a deadbeat who'd abandoned his family, and now she had to grieve for him all over again as a murder victim. He said Thomas had died angry, had spent his last years furious at a ghost who'd supposedly run off, and now Kevin had to live with knowing his father had wasted all that rage on a man who'd been dead the whole time. I told him about the notebook, about how my grandfather had written that he heard William calling from the ground sometimes, and Kevin just nodded like that made perfect sense. We agreed that our families had been used as weapons against each other by dead men who'd taken their real fight to the grave, and that continuing the feud would just mean they'd won even after death. The property line dispute died that night on my porch, not with lawyers or surveys, but with two exhausted men deciding they were done carrying someone else's grudge. I ended up selling the ranch 8 months later to a development company out of Phoenix, the same kind of outside buyer my grandfather had spent decades trying to keep away. Kevin sold his place to the same company, and we split the money from both properties down the middle, settling the survey dispute the way it probably should have been settled 60 years ago. The developers filled in both wells and built a subdivision called Desert Vista Estates, which feels like the final insult to everything our families fought over. I moved to Flagstaff and used my half of the money to start over. Got a job as a land surveyor of all things, which Kevin thought was hilarious when I told him. We talk every few months, mostly text messages, checking in on each other the way people do when they've been through something nobody else would understand. William Brennan got a proper burial in the Valley Cemetery, next to Thomas and the rest of the family, with a headstone that listed the real year of his death. The whole thing taught me that some fights aren't worth inheriting, that you can spend your whole life angry about something that was never really about what you thought it was about. My father died believing he was protecting our family's rights, never knowing he was just protecting a lie my grandfather had built to cover up murder. The well ran dry and exposed everything, and maybe that was always going to happen eventually. You can't build a life on buried secrets. Sooner or later someone drills deep enough to hit the truth. People around here like to say our town never changes, but that is not true. It just hides its cracks better than most places. I have lived in the same small patch of Arizona dust my whole life, waiting tables at the diner on Main Street, raising my son on tips and long shifts. Everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. When Miss Laura, the elementary school teacher every kid adored, vanished, the quiet we were used to turned into something else entirely. It was not silence anymore. It was a kind of listening, like the whole town was holding its breath. Miss Laura had taught half the town's children, including mine. She was the type who stayed late decorating bulletin boards and wrote birthday notes for every student. When she disappeared one night after leaving the school parking lot, people flooded the diner with rumors. Some said she ran away. Others whispered about a man she was seeing. But what struck me most was how the police chief, Patrick, handled it. Distant, rehearsed, too calm for a man who used to panic when a dog went missing. Patrick and I had grown up together. He was the kind of boy who rescued stray cats and fixed people's bikes for free. We used to skip rocks at Miller Lake and talk about how we would both leave someday. I never did, and neither did he. He married young, joined the force, and climbed to the top. After Laura's disappearance, I watched him on the news, standing near the school's flagpole, telling everyone they were doing everything possible. I could tell he was lying. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like the words were something heavy he was forced to carry. A week later, the diner got busier. Journalists came through asking questions, and locals came for comfort food and gossip. That is when I overheard something that made my stomach twist. One of the deputies mentioned finding Laura's phone near the river but being told not to log it officially. He caught my eye mid-sentence and went quiet. When Patrick came in later that evening, he asked to speak with me out back. He smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile. Stretched too far, almost apologetic. He said, "People talk too much when they are scared, don't they, Marla?" After that night, Patrick barely came into the diner. When he did, he sat alone at the counter and kept his radio on even while eating. The deputies avoided eye contact, like the whole department had been told to keep their mouths shut. I tried to let it go. I had bills to pay, a son to raise. But the thought kept creeping back. Why would the chief hide evidence? The first time I mentioned it to anyone was to my co-worker, June. She told me in a whisper that her cousin on night patrol had seen someone unloading boxes from Patrick's truck behind the old storage unit by the grain silos. The kind of detail you would not invent. A few nights later, I got home after closing and saw something folded under my front doormat. It was a piece of lined paper, torn from a notebook, no signature. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "Stop asking questions about Laura." I stood there in the porch light, the sound of crickets around me, reading it again and again. My son was asleep inside. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat at the kitchen table staring at that note until the sun came up. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but deep down I knew it was not. By the next afternoon, word spread that someone had vandalized the memorial set up outside the school. Candles smashed, photos torn. Patrick called it kids being cruel, but no one believed that. The diner stayed full that evening, people too uneasy to eat at home. One of the regulars, an older rancher named Clyde, told me he had seen a black pickup parked behind the diner after hours a few nights ago. No plates, engine off, just sitting there. The timing made my skin crawl. That was the same night the note appeared. The second note came 3 days later. This one was taped to my mailbox. It said, "You do not know who you are dealing with." My hands were still damp from washing dishes when I pulled it off. There was a faint smell on the paper, like gasoline and old cologne. I called Patrick that night, tried to sound calm. He said, "Let me handle it," then changed the subject, asking about my son's grades. It felt rehearsed again, like he had already decided what he wanted me to say, or what I should not. The next morning, I noticed tire marks in the dirt near my fence, deep, uneven, like someone had parked there for a while. I could see where the grass had been flattened. My son said he heard an engine during the night, but he thought it was one of our neighbors. I wanted to believe that too, but when I checked the mailbox later, there was another note. No words this time, just a photo. It was of me standing outside the diner, taken from across the street. My name was written on the back in red ink. I took it straight to Patrick's office, but he barely looked at it. He said it could be a local kid messing around, then filed it away like it was nothing. I watched his hands as he did it, steady, too steady, and I knew he was lying again. That same night I drove to the storage unit by the silos, the one June had mentioned. It was after closing and the town was quiet enough that I could hear the gravel crack under my tires. The lock on the unit was new, too new for a place no one had used in years. I parked behind the dumpsters, grabbed my flashlight, and walked up to it. The padlock was scratched on the side, like someone had forced it open recently. I remember hearing a faint buzzing sound from inside, maybe a fly trapped against metal. When I shone the light through the crack, the beam hit something that made my throat tighten. Stacks of boxes labeled "Evidence Hold," and on top, a small name tag with glitter edges. It said, "Miss Laura." I backed away slowly, heart pounding. Before I could even reach my car, headlights flared behind me. Patrick's truck. He stepped out, no uniform this time, just jeans and a faded sheriff's jacket. His voice was calm but cold. "You should not have come here," he said. The flashlight shook in my hand. He walked closer, blocking the beam with his shadow. "You are putting yourself and your boy in danger, Marla." I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but all I could do was nod. He took the name tag from my hand and tucked it into his jacket pocket before getting back in the truck. The dust from his tires hung in the air long after he was gone. I left town the next morning, packed a few bags, told my son we were visiting family out east and never went back. I do not know what happened to Miss Laura or what Patrick was protecting, but a month later I saw on the news that the storage unit had burned down in an electrical accident. No one was hurt, they said, and no charges were filed. I still get letters sometimes, no return address. The last one said only this: "You did the right thing by leaving." My name is Maya Collins, and I cover community events for the Ashridge Gazette, a paper that still smells like ink by noon. I rent a one-bedroom over a barber shop, the kind with a rattling swamp cooler and a view of cottonwoods and faded storefronts along Cottonwood Avenue. That morning began like any other parade day. Marching band tuning up behind the high school, church ladies taping crepe paper to a flatbed, and kids sticky with melted lemonade before the first float even rolled. I had a checklist in my pocket and a battered camera that sometimes squealed when it zoomed. My editor, Harper Quinn, wanted something soft and neighborly. A photo of elders in pioneer hats usually did the trick. The founding families always rode up front in antique convertibles, waving like royalty with dust in their teeth. People in Ashridge call the parade our spine, the one day a year when the town stands straight. I walked the curb with a notebook and a thermos, already writing captions in my head about small-town pride and the desert sun bouncing off brass instruments. The accident happened halfway down Juniper Road, where the pavement buckles like a quiet ripple. A cherry-red convertible carrying Ethan Barnett lurched hard, skidded sideways, and climbed the curb, crushing a metal bench into the brick wall of the feed store. The crowd made this raw, uncoordinated sound, part shout, part inhale, and then nothing moved right. Confetti kept drifting as if the air had not gotten the news. Ethan did not get up. His cousin, Thomas Pratt, reached for him and kept saying his name in a way that made the syllables bend. Sheriff Nolan Price pushed through with a white rope of tape and a practiced calm that looked borrowed. The marching band stopped mid-song, a trumpet holding one last note that turned thin and strange. I lifted the camera, then lowered it, then lifted it again because that was my job. The hood of the car steamed and ticked. I remember a child nearby asking if this counted as part of the show. Officially, they called it a mechanical failure, quick as snapping a cloth for dust. I wrote the first short for the Gazette from the sidewalk, a sterile 3 paragraphs with tragic and unforeseen and community in shock. Harper nodded but told me to keep my ears open at the clinic and the diner. In Ashridge, news rarely walks through the front door. It clinks in a coffee cup or hides in the pauses between sentences. At the clinic, a nurse with sunburned cheeks said the Barnetts requested privacy, eyes on the floor like the word itself had weight. When I stepped outside, I noticed the convertible's tire marks were not straight but braided, as if the car had been tugged from 2 directions at once. Behind the feed store, in the narrow space where broken pallets lean, I found fresh drag marks in the dust. 2 parallel lines that ended at a round metal plate I had never noticed. It had a hand-sized notch and a faint brand pressed into it. 3 interlocking triangles. I took a photo of that plate, then went hunting for anyone who would talk about it. An auto shop owner named Victor leaned on a fender and swore up and down the car had passed inspection last week. He brushed grease off his palm and said the Barnetts maintain their engines like they maintain their fences. Tight, regular, and nobody else's business. At the diner, a waitress named Piper slid me a refill without asking, and said her grandmother used to whisper about an old settler's pact, the kind people fold into church cookbooks and forget on purpose. Piper said the founding families, Barnett, Lowe, Carver, Pratt, used to meet by the dry riverbed under a cottonwood with a lightning scar. She told me there were rules that sounded like superstition until they did not. Open the vault on parade day. Count the names. Choose the one who guards the rest. She said that last part in a flat voice, then tucked a paper napkin into my pocket with a number on it and a single word. Vault. The napkin number led me to a storage lot behind an abandoned gas station on Willow Bend Road, the kind of place where time stops returning calls. I expected a shed or a cellar, but what I found was a squat concrete structure with a rusted door chained in 3 places. The chain was new, silver against the orange corrosion, and the padlock had a carved pattern identical to the one on the metal plate behind the feed store. I circled the building, stepping over goat-head thorns and an old tire, until I noticed a faint hum. Not electric, more like air being pulled through something narrow. It came from a vent covered by wire mesh near the foundation. When I pressed my ear close, I could hear voices, faint and steady, repeating what sounded like a prayer or chant. Each word ended with the same syllable: ash. I recorded it on my phone, but the audio picked up only wind and static. That night, the Barnetts held a vigil in front of the courthouse, candles lined up in rows that melted faster than anyone could replace them. People cried, hugged, and whispered condolences that sounded rehearsed. I noticed Sheriff Price standing apart near his cruiser, talking quietly with Mayor Ellison and Victor from the auto shop. Their faces were drawn tight, and Victor's hands were shaking as he kept wiping them on a rag that was already clean. When the mayor noticed me watching, he stepped forward, thanked everyone for coming, and reminded the crowd that the parade would continue next year, in Ethan's honor. It landed wrong. A few heads turned and someone muttered, "Too soon." The sheriff's eyes met mine briefly, and it wasn't a warning exactly, but it carried weight. I left before the candles burned out. 2 days later, the number Piper gave me finally answered. A voice rough and slow said, "You need to stop digging before the ground opens again." I asked who it was, but they hung up after whispering, "The families are counting." That same evening, someone slipped an envelope under my apartment door. Inside was a folded page from the town's archive ledger dated 1896, listing the original settlers, and a recurring note beside certain names: Keeper of the Ash. The handwriting looked too neat to belong to a clerk. It looked ceremonial. I went to the Gazette office after dark and pulled the rest of the records. Each generation of those same families had one keeper, always the youngest adult, always marked off with a small cross in the margin. The last recorded keeper was Ethan Barnett. I printed everything and planned to meet Harper the next morning, but when I arrived, the office door was open, lights buzzing. Harper was gone, her desk cleared except for her press badge and a flash drive labeled "Parade Footage." The footage showed the parade from the courthouse angle. Nothing unusual until the moment before the crash. A shadow crossed the frame, low and fast, like someone crouching between floats. Then the car jerked, and I could see Victor by the auto shop, watching it happen, not moving an inch. In the corner of the screen, Sheriff Price's hand went to his radio before the impact. He didn't flinch either. The audio caught something I hadn't noticed in person. A whisper spreading through the crowd, almost synchronized. Ashridge endures. That night I packed my camera, the ledger copy and the flash drive, then drove toward the old storage lot again. The desert air had that strange stillness before a storm, though no clouds moved overhead. I parked a block away and walked with my flashlight off, letting the moon show the path. The chains on the vault door were gone. It hung slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, I expected machinery, maybe old parade props. Instead, there was a sloping tunnel lined with stone blocks, colder than the night outside. The walls were carved with the same 3 triangles I had seen before, painted over in ash-gray pigment. At the far end, a shallow pit flickered with candlelight. 4 figures stood around it in silence, their faces hidden behind plain cloth masks. I recognized the sheriff's boots before I saw his badge glinting near his collar. He told me to put the camera down. His voice was calm, measured, like this was the logical end to everything. The others moved closer. Victor, Mayor Ellison, and a woman I didn't know at first until she spoke. It was Harper. Her eyes were wide but steady, and she said quietly, "It is not about control. It is about balance." She told me every 30 years the pact required renewal, a bloodline to keep the town guarded, from what their ancestors unleashed beneath the riverbed. Ethan's death, she said, was the first half. The second name had already been chosen. Harper stepped aside, revealing a list on parchment pinned to the wall. My name was at the bottom, underlined twice. My throat went dry, and all I could think of was the phrase on the recording: "Ashridge endures." Before they could react, I bolted. The tunnel twisted into a narrow passage that opened somewhere behind the feed store. I ran until I saw the courthouse dome and the empty square where the vigil candles had burned out. My car was still where I left it, keys in the ignition, though I never remember leaving them there. I drove to the next county, checking the rearview mirror until sunrise. At a rest stop, I listened to the recording again. This time, the voices were clear. They were saying, "Ashridge endures through blood." When I looked at my arm, a faint triangle mark was there beneath the skin, as if pressed from the inside out. I quit the Gazette the next day. Harper's replacement told me she had transferred to Phoenix and that the paper was shifting focus to positive stories. The new parade committee announced plans for a memorial statue funded by all 4 founding families. I moved 3 towns away, changed my number, and tried to let the desert wind bury what I had seen. But every year since, a sealed envelope arrives on my porch the week before the parade. Inside, there is always a single photograph of Ashridge's main street, empty, sun-bleached, and waiting. On the back, in neat handwriting, it says the same thing each time: "The town stands straight."